Imagine standing in a cave that has been sealed for 5,000 years. No light, no sound, just cold stone walls covered in ancient paintings of horses, bison, and human hands reaching out from the deep past. Now imagine that those walls, those silent ancient walls, have been holding a secret not carved into stone, not painted in red ochre, but invisible, microscopic, locked inside the rock itself. The DNA of the actual human beings who stood exactly where you are standing right now, tens of thousands of years ago. That is not science fiction. That just happened. And if you think you understand what this means for human history, I promise you, you do not yet. For the first time in the history of science, researchers have successfully recovered ancient human DNA directly from the surfaces of prehistoric cave walls. Not from bones, not from teeth, not from soil, from the walls themselves. The same walls that ancient people touched, breathed on, painted, and leaned against thousands of years ago. And what that DNA revealed is not just a cool scientific footnote, it is a discovery that fundamentally reshapes how we understand who painted these caves, who visited them, and what these places actually meant to the people who used them. This is the kind of discovery that comes along once in a generation, and you are watching it happen in real time. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why this discovery is so earth-shattering, you first need to understand the world of prehistoric cave art, and why it has kept scientists up at night for over a century. Deep in the mountains of northern Spain, there is a cave called Altamira. It sits quietly near the small historic town of Santillana del Mar, in the region of Cantabria. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than a hillside. But inside, hidden beneath the rock, the ceiling is covered in some of the most breathtaking art ever created by human. Hands. Bison painted in rich reds, blacks, and violets. Deer. Horses. Human hands outlined in pigment. These paintings date back somewhere between 14,000 and 36,000 years ago, placing them firmly in the upper Paleolithic period, when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers who had not yet invented writing, farming, or any of the things we associate with civilization. And yet they created art of staggering complexity and emotional power. On the ceilings of caves, crouched down in the darkness, working by firelight, often painting above their own heads in positions they could not have found comfortable. Why? Who were they? And what were these caves to them? Those questions have haunted archaeology for over 100 years. When Altamira was first discovered in 1868 by a local hunter, and then its paintings were identified by the amateur archaeologist Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola in 1879, the scientific establishment flat out refused to believe it. The paintings were too good, too sophisticated, too emotionally resonant. Surely, the experts said, prehistoric people could not have created art like this. Sautuola was accused of forgery. He died without ever seeing his name cleared. It was not until 1902, after similar paintings were found in cave after cave across the Franco-Cantabrian region of Spain and France, that the scientific world finally admitted the truth. These paintings were real, they were ancient, and they were made by people who were, in every meaningful way, just like us. Over in Portugal, another cave tells a similar story. Escarel Cave, tucked into the Alentejo region in the south of the country, was discovered in 1963. It is one of the only places in Portugal where Paleolithic artwork exists. The earliest signs of human presence at Escarel date back 50,000 years, to a time when Neanderthals were still using the cave as a hunting shelter. Long before modern humans arrived on the scene, the cave later became a site of Upper Paleolithic art, with engravings and paintings of horses, deer, bovids, and abstract symbols covering its walls. And eventually, in the Chalcolithic period, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the cave was sealed, its entrance was buried, and it stayed that way, untouched, undisturbed, locked in darkness for thousands of years. Until 1963, when excavations began again. That long period of sealing, it turns out, is going to be one of the most important details in this entire story. Now, here is where the new science comes in, and here is where everything changes. An international team of scientists, working through a major research initiative called the First Art Project, set out to study the chemistry and age of prehistoric cave art in Spain and Portugal. The project was led by researchers in Spain and Portugal, working in collaboration with institutions across the United Kingdom, China, and Germany, including the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. The Max Planck Institute is one of the most prestigious centers for the study of ancient DNA in the entire world. These are the people who revolutionized our understanding of Neanderthal genetics. These are the people who discovered the Denisovans, a completely unknown branch of ancient humanity, from a single finger bone. When Max Planck researchers get involved in something, you pay attention. The team visited 11 caves in Spain and Portugal and collected samples from 24 separate rock art panels. They used sterilized scalpels and double layers of gloves to scrape tiny samples from both painted and unpainted surfaces of the cave walls. In total, they collected 120 samples. And then they took those samples back to the laboratory and did something no one had ever seriously attempted before at this scale. They tried to extract ancient human DNA from the cave wall material itself. Here is why that was considered almost impossible before this study. DNA is fragile. It degrades over time. Heat destroys it. Moisture destroys it. Light destroys it. To survive for thousands of years, DNA needs very specific conditions. Cold, dry, dark environments. Bones can sometimes provide those conditions. Sediment can sometimes preserve DNA traces. But cave walls? Cave walls are exposed to everything. Air circulates through them, water seeps through the rock, temperature fluctuates. And on top of all of that, every tourist, every researcher, every scientist who has ever touched these walls or breathed near them has potentially left their own modern DNA on the surface, contaminating whatever might have been there originally. The idea that you could find authentic, ancient, uncontaminated human DNA on the surface of a cave wall that has been visited for decades, maybe centuries, seemed almost scientifically hopeless. And yet, out of 120 samples, 5 of them came back with something extraordinary. 5 samples contained authentic, ancient human mitochondrial DNA. And in 2 of those samples, there was human DNA, but absolutely no animal DNA whatsoever. That specific combination is critically important, because if the DNA had blown in on dust, or been carried by animals, or contaminated the wall indirectly through dirt or debris, you would almost certainly see animal DNA mixed in with it. The absence of animal DNA in those 2 samples is very strong evidence that the human DNA was deposited there directly, by a human being, through saliva, sweat, skin cells, or another bodily fluid. Someone touched that wall, or breathed on it, or pressed their lips against it as they blew pigment through a hollow bone, and the genetic ghost of that moment has survived for thousands of years in the stone. Like and subscribe, because what we are about to get into is the part that will blow your mind completely open. The first critical sample came from Escarel cave in Portugal. Specifically, it came from a place called Panel 11, an unassuming section of cave wall covered in a red dot. Not a grand bison, not a dramatic hand stencil, just a small red dot made from a mineral pigment. But over that red dot, over thousands of years, a thin crust of calcite had formed. Calcite is a natural mineral that drips down cave walls and slowly hardens, like a geological lid pressed over the surface beneath it. That calcite crust had acted like a sealed vault, locking in whatever was underneath, including the DNA. When scientists analyzed the pigment and calcite sample from Panel 11, they found ancient human DNA belonging to a Homo sapiens who lived at least 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And because the cave was sealed after the Chalcolithic period and not reopened until 1963, there was essentially no way for modern contamination to have reached that spot. The DNA had been sitting there, perfectly preserved, locked under calcite for millennia. But that was not the most surprising finding from Escarel. The team also sampled sections of the cave wall that had no pigment on them at all. Unpainted, unmarked rock. These were originally collected as what scientists call negative controls. In a controlled experiment, negative controls are samples you collect from areas where you do not expect to find anything, so you can confirm that your results in the positive samples are real and not just an artifact of your methods. The researchers expected these blank wall samples to come back empty. Instead, they also contained ancient human DNA. People had touched those bare walls, they had rested their hands against plain rock. They had brushed past plain stone in the dark, and the DNA of that contact survived. That finding exploded every assumption the team had walking into the study. Similar results came from Coveron Cave in northern Spain, where 2 additional unpigmented wall samples also yielded authentic ancient human DNA. And those Coveron samples were remarkable for another reason entirely. They contained enough genetic material to go beyond basic identification. The researchers were able to analyze not just the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed through the maternal line and gives broad genetic ancestry information, but also nuclear DNA, which is the full genome. And the nuclear DNA placed the individuals who left those traces firmly within the Western hunter-gatherer genetic cluster. Western hunter-gatherers were the population of ancient modern humans who inhabited Europe during and after the last ice age, between roughly 5,000 and 17,000 years ago. Their genetic signature has been found in ancient burials and skeletal remains from across the Iberian Peninsula. And now, for the first time, that same signature has been found not in a grave, not in a skeleton, but on the surface of a cave wall where a person once stood. Like and subscribe. Because this next part is where science fiction becomes reality. Think about what that actually means. A woman? Because 3 of the 5 positive DNA samples were predominantly female in origin, walked into a cave somewhere between 5,000 and 17,000 years ago, She walked through darkness, probably carrying a torch or a lamp burning animal fat. She came to a section of cave wall and she touched it. Maybe she was an artist. Maybe she was someone who came to watch the artist's work. Maybe she was a child who ran her fingers along the stone out of curiosity. Maybe she was a shaman performing some ritual we will never fully understand. She touched the wall. She left behind the invisible trace of her existence, and that trace survived. Not in her bones, which are long gone, not in her tools, which have crumbled to dust, in the wall itself, in the stone that has been standing in that cave for millions of years. She is gone, but the wall remembers her. This changes the entire paradigm of how scientists can study prehistoric human presence. Up until now, if archaeologists wanted genetic information about who occupied a cave, they needed to find human remains, bones, teeth, skeletal fragments, and those things are rare. Preservation is unpredictable. Burial is not guaranteed. Entire populations of ancient humans have left us essentially nothing in the way of skeletal remains, and so we have essentially nothing in the way of genetic information about them. But caves are everywhere. Tens of thousands of caves exist across Europe, Asia, Africa, and beyond, many of them containing evidence of ancient human activity. And if those cave walls can preserve human DNA, even in the absence of art, even in the absence of tools, even in the absence of any deliberate archaeological deposit, then those walls become an entirely new archive of human history. The lead researcher on this study, Alba Bossums Mesa, a doctoral researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, put it in terms that even the most skeptical scientist would find difficult to dismiss. She said, and this is almost too remarkable to fully absorb, that it is now possible to recover DNA from somebody who leaned on a wall 20,000, 30,000, or 40,000 years ago. Stop and sit with that for a moment. 40,000 years ago. That is more than 400 centuries. That is before the peak of the last ice age. That is before human beings had spread to every corner of the planet. And we may now be able to read the genetic identity of someone who briefly rested against a cave wall in that unimaginably distant era. Now, the scientists are careful to be honest about the limitations of this discovery, because real science is always honest about what it cannot yet prove. The DNA found in these samples cannot be directly and definitively connected to the artists who created the cave paintings. The DNA and the pigment might have arrived on the wall at different times, potentially thousands of years apart from each other. A later visitor to the cave might have touched the same wall surface that an earlier person had painted. The red dot on panel 11 at Escarel might have been painted by one person and then touched by someone else 1,000 years later. And it is the second person's DNA that survived. Science cannot yet disentangle those possibilities with certainty. What it can say, what it has now definitively proven for the first time, is that ancient human DNA can survive on cave walls for thousands of years, that this DNA preserves enough information to determine the biological sex and the genetic ancestry of the individuals who left it there. Like and subscribe, because what we're going to talk about next is where this discovery takes us in the future. And it is genuinely one of the most exciting directions in all of modern science. The Altamira Cave in Spain is perhaps the most famous prehistoric art site in the world. It was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985. Its paintings of bison, horses, and deer, created using polychrome pigments of red, black, and violet, are so sophisticated, so artistically accomplished that when they were first discovered in 1879, they were dismissed as impossible. The cave is now closed to the public to protect the art, and even scientists must request special permission to enter and sample anything inside. The research team tested a particularly interesting object from Altamira, a prehistoric bird bone that appears to have been used as an airbrush, a tool for blowing red ochre pigment onto the cave walls. If any object in the archaeological world was going to contain DNA from the actual artist, it would be a tool pressed to someone's lips. But the bird bone came back negative for ancient DNA. The reason is almost certainly contamination. Decades of researchers handling the object with ungloved hands, the accumulation of modern DNA from countless visitors and scientists, had overwritten whatever ancient traces might have once been there. The very objects we have been most eager to study may have been ruined by the study itself, while the plain, untouched walls have quietly kept their secrets intact. That finding carries a profound lesson for future research. The most valuable genetic information in prehistoric sites may not be in the objects that look most interesting to archaeologists. It may be in the plain rock surfaces, the blank walls, the overlooked corners that no one has thought to study, precisely because no one has touched them. Future cave studies will need to think about preservation in a completely new way, treating entire cave wall surfaces as potential genetic archives and being extremely careful not to contaminate them through casual handling. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond Spain and Portugal. There are thousands of caves around the world with evidence of prehistoric human occupation. Caves in Indonesia contain some of the oldest figurative art ever discovered, dating back more than 45,000 years. Caves in South Africa contain evidence of symbolic behavior going back well over 70,000 years. Caves in France, Chauvet, Lascaux, Fond de Gaume, contain paintings of extraordinary beauty and complexity from the same upper Paleolithic period as Altamira. Every single one of these sites now becomes a potential target for ancient DNA recovery from cave wall surfaces. Not every site will yield results. The study found ancient DNA in only 5 out of 120 samples, which is a reminder that preservation is still hit or miss, dependent on temperature, humidity, the specific mineral composition of the wall, and a dozen other variables. But the possibility is now established. The proof of concept exists, the science works. One of the most intriguing aspects of this discovery is what it may eventually tell us about the gender dynamics and social structures of prehistoric communities. 3 of the 5 positive DNA samples were predominantly female. This is consistent with some other genetic studies of ancient European populations, but it is still striking. We have long imagined prehistoric cave painters as solitary male hunter artists, lone geniuses painting bison by torchlight. The emerging picture is considerably more nuanced. Women were in these caves. They were touching the walls. They may have been the painters themselves, or they may have been the people who accompanied and assisted the painters, or they may have visited the caves for entirely different reasons that we do not yet understand. The DNA does not tell us the whole story, but it begins to tell us a story that the bones alone never could. Like and subscribe. This is the part where everything we thought we knew starts to crack open. There is a philosophical dimension to this discovery that goes beyond the science, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Human beings have a fundamental need to be remembered. We write books, we build monuments, we carve our names into tree bark and take photographs of ourselves with our phones and post them to the internet so that somewhere, some record of our existence will persist after we are gone. The people who painted these caves had no books, no monuments, no photographs. They had stone, and they left their marks on it, not just in the paintings, but in the invisible molecular traces of their living bodies. They did not know that their DNA was being preserved. They were not thinking about genetic analysis when they ran their fingers along the wall or pressed their palms into the pigment. But something of them survived anyway, locked into the stone, waiting for tens of thousands of years for a species of scientist with the right tools to come and find it. The lead co-author of the study, Ippolito Collado Giraldo, said something that cuts right to the heart of what this discovery means. He said this is not just about rock art. It is about understanding how people used caves and where they left their marks. That statement is deceptively simple. What it is really saying is that caves were not just canvases. They were gathering places, ritual spaces, shelters, workshops. They were the living rooms and temples and community centers of the Ice Age world. And the walls of those spaces absorbed the presence of the people who used them, the way the walls of an old house absorb the echoes of every conversation ever spoken within them. Except in caves, those echoes are molecular, and now we can begin to read them. The study was published in the journal Nature Communications, one of the most respected scientific publications on the planet. The findings were peer-reviewed by independent experts and have been covered by outlets ranging from National Geographic to the Max Planck Society's own press releases. This is not fringe science. This is not a preliminary finding from a single graduate student working in a basement. This is a well-resourced, internationally collaborative, peer-reviewed breakthrough that has already been validated by the scientific community. And the scientists involved are not resting on this discovery. The plan, going forward, is to dramatically expand the search. More caves, more samples, better methods for extracting and authenticating ancient DNA from rock surfaces, improved techniques for differentiating ancient genetic material from modern contamination. Crucially, the team hopes to develop approaches that can identify DNA not just from the surfaces that people touched, but potentially from the sediment layers beneath cave floors, which might preserve DNA traces from even deeper in time. The goal, eventually, is to build a genetic map of prehistoric cave use, to understand not just who was in which cave, but when, how often, in what numbers, from what populations, and what their relationship was to the populations in neighboring caves. To reconstruct the social and demographic world of the Ice Age from the molecular ghosts left behind on stone walls. Like and subscribe, because this is just the beginning, and where it goes from here is almost beyond imagining. Think about what a fully realized version of this science would look like. A researcher in a cave in southern France scrapes a tiny sample from a bare patch of wall deep in a gallery that has not been disturbed in 15,000 years. Back in the laboratory, they extract DNA from that sample. They identify the genetic ancestry of the person who touched that wall. They compare it to the ancestry of people identified from other caves in the region from the same period. They start to see patterns. This population was here. That population was there. These two groups overlapped in this valley. These groups never seemed to share the same caves at all. From invisible traces on stone, the entire social geography of a vanished Ice Age world begins to emerge. That is not a fantasy. That is the logical endpoint of the science that was just published in Nature Communications. The tools exist. The methods are being refined. The only limits are time, funding, and the patience of the stone. The people who painted Altamira and Escarel and thousands of other decorated caves across the prehistoric world were fully human. Their brains were the same size as ours. Their capacity for language, for emotion, for abstract thought, for creativity, for love, for grief, all of it was the same as ours. They looked up at the same stars we look up at. They wanted to leave something behind, some mark of their passing, some proof that they had been here. They pressed their hands against the wall and blew pigment around their fingers and left a silhouette that says, I was here, I existed, I mattered. And now science is answering them back. We found you. Not just your paintings, not just your tools, you. Your actual biological self, written in the language that all life is written in, preserved in the stone you touched with your living hands. Tens of thousands of years later, across a gulf of time so vast, it is almost impossible to comprehend. We read your message, and we are listening. This is what science does at its very best. It collapses time. It dissolves the distance between us and the past. It reminds us that the story of humanity does not start with writing or cities. It starts in a firelit cave, with a hand pressed against cold stone and a person feeling something we would recognize immediately as pride. That story has been waiting in the walls for thousands of years. And now, finally, we can begin to read it.